سلام علیکم، من مریم آتش نوابی هستم و برنامه پل خوش آمدید.
Good evening and welcome to Pull. As the world's largest democracy and a country with a long history of cultural connections to the Afghan people, India has a key role to play in the rebuilding of Afghanistan. Tonight, I'll discuss these issues with Ambassador Dennis Kux, former U.S. Ambassador to the Ivory Coast and a senior policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Institute. Lisa Curtis, a senior fellow on South Asia at the Heritage Foundation, and Marvin Weinbaum, scholar in residence at the Middle East Institute.
The Obama administration has seemed to be taking a different approach to relations with India compared to the Bush administration. Why, Marvin, do you think that they're taking this approach, and do you think that will affect cooperation in Afghanistan?
Well, it continues to be, in some ways, an extension, as I see it, of the Bush policy, and that is to see these countries as both important for American foreign policy, but not necessarily have it closely linked so that one policy is dependent on another policy, recognizing that each country has to be addressed on its own terms, and that American interests will vary between the two countries. Obviously, with India, that focuses heavily on the economic side. With Pakistan now, it's the strategic relationship involving primarily now our efforts here in counterterrorism in Afghanistan.
Lisa, there's always been this talk of AFPAC, so we have to look at Afghanistan and Pakistan together. But if this is a regional approach, shouldn't India be included in that?
Well, I would say that the Obama administration has sent some mixed messages to India on its role in the region. And this first happened over the issue of Kashmir. And even before President Obama was elected president, when he was candidate Obama, he made some controversial statements about wanting to designate an envoy on Kashmir to look more closely into that situation. So I think that sent one signal to India. And then I would say more recently on India's role in Afghanistan. And this comes from General McChrystal's report, which was released last August, in which General McChrystal had stated that if India were to increase its footprint in Afghanistan, Pakistan was likely to react negatively. And this had the implication that we should question India getting more involved in Afghanistan rather than the Pakistani reaction. Now, I think some of that has been corrected by the U.S.-India strategic dialogue, which happened a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was made clear there that the U.S. did appreciate the role of India in Afghanistan. And so I think there's been some course correcting there by the Obama administration.
You mentioned the issue of Kashmir. Do you think that issue affects India-U.S. relations?
Not really. I think the U.S.-India relationship has its own trajectory, and that's largely driven by the fact that India's economy is rapidly growing. India is increasing its political, economic clout throughout the world, and the U.S. sees India as an important partner, not because of what's happening in South Asia, but really East Asia, and in terms of China and China's rise. So really the U.S. relationship with India right now is driven largely by the role the U.S. sees it playing in the broader Asia and indeed global context.
Ambassador Kux, India doesn't have any troops in Afghanistan. They are training the Afghan National Army now. But do you think that the Indian government is concerned about the U.S. withdrawal of U.S. troops next year?
Well, I think the Indians are very concerned about that because for them the nightmare scenario is for Afghanistan to fall back into the sort of situation it had before 9/11. With a government, with the Taliban in a strong position, and above all with Pakistan having a strong position. Because for both India and Pakistan, Afghanistan represents a sort of proxy, where they have a sort of proxy struggle playing out there, some of their other problems over Kashmir and over so many other issues. And so the Indians are very concerned about that.
You were part of the Afghanistan study group that recommended that there should be greater involvement of the regional countries on the Afghanistan issues, but some feel that this administration hasn't really followed up on those recommendations, particularly in the case of India. Do you think the U.S. is holding back?
Well, I think, as Lisa mentioned, we're sort of caught because the Pakistanis have made very clear that they're very concerned about India's presence in Afghanistan, the various Indian consulates they see as feeding unrest in Pakistan.
Lisa, you mentioned the strategic dialogue with India that took place with the U.S. Did any of that touch on Afghanistan?
I think Afghanistan definitely did come up in that strategic dialogue, and I would assume that India did raise some of its concerns, particularly about the issue of reconciliation with the Taliban. As Dennis mentioned, the Indians fear that the situation will go back to the 1990s, where the Taliban dominated the country, where Pakistan played a very large role. So I think that there are some concerns there, and I'm almost certain that it would have come up.
But we don't know if any of the dialogue resulted in any concrete change with India's role in Afghanistan.
Well, what I saw was statements coming from President Obama, from Secretary Clinton on down, making a point that the U.S. appreciated India's role in Afghanistan, the role it's played in terms of pledging development assistance. India's pledged $1.2 billion in development assistance, help rebuild the parliament building, is supporting democracy in that country. So I think the U.S. made it clear that it appreciates India's role. And I think that was important because, as I mentioned, there had been some mixed signals sent, almost as if the Obama administration was listening too closely to Pakistani demands for the U.S. to try to reduce Indian presence in Afghanistan. But I think we saw through the strategic dialogue that that is not the direction that the Obama administration intends to move in.
So they're seeking to balance both Indian concerns and Pakistani concerns.
Well, I don't think the U.S. policy should be trying to balance Indian and Pakistani concerns in Afghanistan. The policy should be to support the Afghan government to fend off Taliban domination of the country and to be able to support a strong and stable Afghanistan. And the U.S. should support the activities of those countries that are supporting that goal and counter the activities of those countries that are countering that goal.
Marvin, but some people would say that if that's the case, then the U.S. should really look at India's concerns that if they don't have as much of a role after, the troop withdrawals, that Pakistan could play a role in supporting the Taliban again. Do you think that's a valid concern?
They are very concerned about what Pakistan will be up to were they to leave, certainly, and leave behind an unstable situation there. As has been said here, they feel they have a very heavy investment on this. They don't want to see, above all, the expansion of a radicalized, militarized Islamic force, which would provide a kind of strategic depth on both sides of the border. They want to avoid that. Now, while the Pakistanis are very concerned about India's role now, it strikes me very ironic that they are unable to see what a victory by the Taliban might produce. And that, what I'm referring to now, is that if things don't go well, and we're looking then at a civil war, there are a great many people who believe under those circumstances, India will play a far larger role, a far more aggressive role, and it would not be unexpected that, in fact, that India might even provide military advisors, if not more.
I'll continue my conversation about India's relationship with Afghanistan when we return. I'm back with Dennis Kux, Lisa Curtis, and Marvin Weinbaum.
Ambassador Kux, we talked about there's really no Indian troop presence at this point. They are providing some training. But what do you think are some of these strategic concerns that have prevented them from not sending troops to partake in ISAF?
Well, I think if they did, the Pakistanis would go absolutely berserk. and that would be a red line for the Pakistanis. It's something that they wouldn't accept. And since we are so terribly dependent upon the Pakistanis for the operations in Afghanistan, we also, in effect, wouldn't accept it. It would be just pushing things too far from the standpoint of the Indians.
Moving to another aspect, the trade relations between the countries. You know, India has been a big consumer of dried fruits and nuts from Afghanistan. Pakistan has allowed those goods to export from Afghanistan to India, but not allowed Indian goods to transit through Pakistan. Has there been any progress on this issue?
Not really. It's one of the things that the Pakistanis, one of the levers they feel they have to pressure, the Indians, and it's not something they're likely to give up very easily.
But do you think the United States, given its role in Afghanistan, should put some pressure on the Pakistanis?
Well, I think we have tried, but without any real success. We have, raised this whole issue of trade and transit, because obviously it would be better if the Indians could ship things directly, but it just hasn't been successful so far, given Pakistani attitudes.
Marvin, what do you think? Many Afghan business people would say, hey, this is affecting the price of goods that come into this country, including for reconstruction projects. Should the U.S. be taking a more active role to try to get Pakistan to change this policy?
Well, we have, as Dennis has suggested, we have tried here. But remember that this trade issue is really mostly about Afghanistan and Pakistan. Pakistan provides the route by which Afghanistan is able to import goods from the rest of the world. And that trade agreement, which has been in place for a long time and sometimes been under pressure in the past, they have to be very careful here that they are able to maintain this relationship, continue to train this relationship. Afghanistan could not have a successful economy without Pakistan's cooperation.
Well, we do see Iran kind of coming in and building Chabahar port. Do you think that will change the dynamics?
Well, it has certainly made a difference. And when you ask about the strategic interests that India has built the road to the Chabahar port. And that's clearly giving them an alternative to a land route over Pakistan, but also challenging the Pakistanis as the outlet to the sea, whether we're talking about Gwadar, the new port, or Karachi. Now it may be very possible for countries in Central Asia, for example, as well as Afghanistan, to see that their trade route will run via the Ring Road in Afghanistan and out the Chabahar Road. And this is a real challenge to Pakistan and is a point of leverage here that Afghanistan can use, I think, to rectify this problem here of not being able to receive goods directly from India.
And Lisa, how much of India's long-term strategy in Afghanistan do you think is linked to oil issues in terms of trying to get access of oil and natural gas from Central Asia?
Well, I think that's part of it. India's energy needs are growing exponentially as the Indian economy grows. So a gateway to Central Asia, oil and gas, certainly might be part of it. But again, I think the number one priority is ensuring that you don't have an unfriendly state that will be supporting militants that are attacking India. I think that's the number one goal. But getting back to this issue of Indian goods transiting Pakistan into Afghanistan, I think the fact that Pakistan is not allowing this is just one indicator of how bad the relations are between India and Pakistan, and how Afghanistan has become their the new site of their proxy battle with each other. Because in, I think it was 2003, Pakistan did allow sort of a one-time shipment of goods coming from India through Pakistan to Afghanistan. And the U.S. has worked very hard on this issue with Pakistan, but I think this shows that the U.S. Doesn't have as much leverage as one would think, despite the billions of aid that the U.S. is providing Pakistan.
Ambassador, what do you think of this, India's accusations that Pakistan keeps meddling in Afghanistan, and that until they stop their support for the Taliban, that really peace and development in Afghanistan can't really be sought?
Well, I think it's true that the Pakistanis have been helping, or turning a blind eye in the case of the Taliban, helping other groups like Haqqani, and have been very much involved in Afghanistan, in part to looking to the future, fearing that the United States will, and NATO will be withdrawing, and wanting to make sure they have their equities there in Afghanistan. So they have been, they continue to be involved there. They in turn see, I think incorrectly, they overstate what the Indians are up to. It's hard to believe that the consulates in Jalalabad and Kandahar are, causing all the troubles that one has in Baluchistan, the Pakistanis have in Baluchistan. But the Pakistanis remain terribly sensitive on this issue.
And do you think the U.S. should play a role in trying to ease those tensions before the troop withdrawal?
Well, the U.S. The U.S. does try to ease these tensions, but again, those tensions we have tried and tried and tried in the past to improve relations, reduce tensions between India and Pakistan, and we've never really succeeded because these problems like that have their own dynamic. And we just don't have the leverage that you might think we would have, especially with Pakistan, where we're putting in so much aid.
More on the relationship between India, Afghanistan, and the United States when we return. I'm back with Dennis Kux, Lisa Curtis, and Marvin Weinbaum.
Lisa, going back to the issue of assistance and aid, you mentioned that there's some lessons that the U.S. could learn from India and how it's using its aid in Afghanistan. India has asked for better oversight and monitoring of U.S. assistance to Pakistan, especially on the military front. Do you think the United States has adequately addressed those concerns?
Well, I think there are major concerns both in how the aid is delivered and what are the conditions on the aid, because the U.S. has its own issues with Pakistan. Setting India's concerns aside, the U.S. has conditioned military assistance to Pakistan on it continuing to crack down on extremist groups, including the Lashkar-e-Taiba groups that target India, as well as the Afghan Taliban, the Haqqani network, and the U.S. has been calling on Pakistan to address militarily the Haqqani network in North Waziristan for several months now, and Pakistan has been balking at that. So I would just say that there are many concerns about U.S. assistance going to Pakistan. But right now, the Obama administration is operating on the hope that if it supports Pakistan with its military needs and helps increase its counterinsurgency efforts, that Pakistan will begin to take on all of these militant groups in a more holistic fashion, which will help in stabilizing Afghanistan and getting at some of these terrorist groups.
But Ambassador Kux, some Afghans would say that, look, this military assistance was increased in the past few years, and we're seeing an increase in the violence. So if Pakistan is not delivering, why should the U.S. assistance keep increasing, number one, and that there's still not this great oversight? What would you respond to?
Well, I think we're operating with a lot of hopes for the future. And we're closer to the Pakistanis. We talk with the Pakistanis a lot more. There's been, if you look in the military side, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has had I don't know how many visits to Islamabad, and we're hoping that this will create greater understanding and that one will eventually see some progress, and for the Pakistanis to move beyond dealing with the Pakistani Taliban, which they have been dealing with, and to move more aggressively against some of the other groups. It's one can argue, one can question whether this will happen. If it doesn't happen, of course, it doesn't bode well for the future prospects in Afghanistan.
I mean, you both talked about, the U.S. hopes that things will improve, but if it hasn't, some Afghans would say that why keep giving these high levels of military assistance to Pakistan?
Well, the Pakistanis, to some extent, have us over the barrel, to be blunt.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because most of the supplies that go to the forces in Afghanistan run through Pakistan. And if the Pakistanis were to turn that tap off, it would be very difficult for us to continue.
Lisa, we talked about aid and trade routes. some people say, well, India is really using its soft power more than in hard power. They're not sending the military assistance, but they are using trade and education and other means to have an influence in Afghanistan. Do you think they've been effective with that?
Well, I think the polling says it all. The polling that I've seen, the view of most Afghans toward India is extremely favorable. And if you compare that to polling taken on attitudes towards Pakistan, I think the situation is much different. So I think that probably they have been very effective in how they've carried out their development and aid policies toward Afghanistan.
Ambassador Kux, do you think the U.S. could learn from that rather than sending more troops, which is very costly, increasing its assistance for programs that will help the Afghan people and show them that the U.S. is really there to assist?
Well, I think that would help. But on the other hand, it's very hard to push through the development programs if you don't have more security. And for more security, at least for the present, you do need more troops. So it's a difficult choice to make.
And do you foresee, with the planned drawdown of U.S. troops starting next year, that the U.S. will have a continued role in reconstruction efforts?
Oh, I would think so. And it isn't necessarily, the administration has hedged what it is going to do next year, particularly in the last few days. So they might very well have a token drawdown and continue to, have large numbers of troops remaining there.
And following up on that, there's talks of troop drawdowns, but then talk of having a continued presence. And the Taliban have said that we will negotiate for peace once there's a removal of foreign troops. So do you think that peace is possible with this condition?
Well, if foreign troops leave, obviously the capacity of the Afghan government to survive, I think, is very questionable. Without the international presence, it doesn't seem as if they would have a very long life expectancy. So, but I agree here. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan, the words of the president, which indicated that we would begin a troop withdrawal a year from next month, have been taken to mean that means we're out of there, we're leaving. Certainly, for the economic and development side, everyone recognizes we're talking about another decade or more. Afghanistan is going to remain a dependent country. The question is, can we use our military for the time that we have it there to create the conditions in which our assistance can effectively make a difference in the country. We're in a great experiment now, which is underway to see whether it's not too late to do things that perhaps should have been done 5 years ago. And if we fail with this, I don't think that there are many people who believe that we're going to get the chance to do the development that's so necessary.
My thanks to Ambassador Dennis Kux, Lisa Curtis, and Marvin Weinbaum for speaking with me. We'd love to hear what you think about this or any other pool program. Just go online to aamtv.tv or visit us at tolo.tv. See you next week for another edition of Pool.